The Entrepreneur's Library, episode 215.
Welcome to the Entrepreneur's Library, the only book-centric podcast that reviews all the top-selling business books and shares authors' perspective firsthand. This is your resource to finding the next great book that will enable you to grow personally and professionally. Welcome your host, Wade Danielson.
Welcome back to the EL. Today we have Hans Finzel, author of The Top 10 Mistakes Leaders Make. This episode really resonated with me because there were several that I feel like maybe at one point I was doing a good job, and some maybe I never was doing a good job, and so I've really got to pick up the ball. But there were a few that I think I used to do a really good job at and have fallen back. So some phenomenal content coming your way. Let's bring on Hans. Welcome, Hans, and thank you for joining us on the Entrepreneur's Library.
Hey, great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we take a deep dive into your book, will you take just a moment to introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about you personally.
Okay, Hans Finzel. You probably wonder, where's a guy like that from? Not from Germany, not from Austria, from Huntsville, Alabama. I was born and raised in Alabama. My father was a rocket scientist, part of NASA. There's a whole bunch of Germans there in Huntsville, so that was my background. I have spent my career actually in the nonprofit world mostly, and became more and more interested in leadership. After 20 years as a CEO of a nonprofit, I left that to start my own work, just full-time helping leaders do a better job, leaders and managers. So that's my passion, is to really help leaders take their leadership to the next level. And we'll get into why that became a passion of mine. But today, I'm just doing a lot of podcasting on leadership. My own podcast is The Leadership Answer Man on iTunes, and I keep churning out books because I love to write about leadership. So that's just a little bit about who I am.
On your podcast,
let me say, excuse me, Wade, I'm a father of 4 great kids.
Excellent.
I've been married to a wonderful wife, Donna, for a long, long time. So that's who I am as well.
Perfect. Thank you for sharing that. I had one quick question before we dive into the book, and that's your podcast, Leadership Answer Man. Is that one where people could call in, ask questions, and then you answer them?
No, it's not. It's a teaching on leadership, about 25 minutes a show. I do have a lot of people submit questions that I answer on the show, but it's not a call-in show and it's not an interview show. It's really a show about just great leadership principles.
Excellent. Well, before we depart, I'd like for you to be able to give the listener a little bit more information on that, so maybe they can write in on a topic that they have on hand. But now let's jump right into the book, The Top 10 Mistakes Leaders Make, which is made available, you said the latest edition, October 2007. So Hans, we're going to move quickly, but our whole goal here today is to get the top questions answered and to give the listener, the future reader, a great idea of what this book's all about. So the first question is, what was the inspiration behind writing The Top 10 Mistakes Leaders Make? Working under a bad leader.
When I speak, and I do a lot of speaking on leadership, I ask people, did any of you ever worked for a terrible boss? Just about 95% of the people raise their hands. I worked for a guy that just totally frustrated me and stood in the way of my visions and dreams for what I wanted to do, crushed my spirit to the point where I lost respect and finally left that whole job and that whole place. And that was really the inspiration. When I became a leader, I wanted to study how to be a good leader, not a bad leader, and how to inspire people and empower people instead of frustrating people.
So what would you, I love this question because it's so important these days to differentiate books. There's so many out there. So what makes your book different from others regarding the same or similar topic?
I think one of the biggest differences is that I have done leadership for 30 years. And so I don't write academically out of a classroom, or, there are people that are writing all kinds of leadership books that have never been a leader. It's very practical. It's very simple. It's very usable. I put the cookies on the lower shelf, and I'd say the uniqueness of my material is it's born in real life leadership.
That's excellent. That's what we love to have on this show too. Is not someone who's speaking from a point of theory. It's great if you went and got a doctorate in leadership, but have you actually led? So I love that you brought that up. And Hans, how do you suggest the reader engage with your book? Is this one they can jump in, jump out, gathering information as needed, or did you write it to be read from front to back?
Actually, you can easily jump in and jump out. There are 10 chapters. We'll talk about them in a minute. Each one is a standalone idea. And, you can pick it up and digest some of it and leave it and come back later. You don't have to sit and read the whole thing in one session. But I do have a lot of nice little sidebars, little nuggets that you can pull out, even if you only have 5 minutes. So, yeah, you can read it at your own pace, and every chapter is chock full of great ideas. And at the end of every chapter, I make applications and takeaways.
Perfect. So, Hans, we're not in my favorite part of the entire interview. It's where I want to hand over the mic and allow you to take the next 5 to 8 minutes and give this future reader a great idea of what your book's all about. Will you do that for us?
I sure will. So the title of the book is The Top 10 Mistakes Leaders Make. And people wonder, how did I come up with that? And have I made, all these mistakes? And I always say, listen, I've made 100 or maybe 1,000, but I only chose the top 10 to put in the book. So the first thing I want to say is I've made all these mistakes and learned from it. But I chose these 10 because as I went on my journey as a CEO of a $35 million international nonprofit, had a lot of people reporting to me, did a lot of hiring and firing and team building and problem solving. I began to conclude that these were the top 10 of all the mistakes that I see leaders make. And here's the idea. You can be 90% effective, but you have a blind spot. Some habit or something you don't do that really neutralizes your leadership. The famous guru Peter Drucker said, sometimes in leadership training and development, we don't need to learn what to start doing. We need to learn what to stop doing. And I found that these are some practices that really stand in the way of great leadership. So that's kind of an overview. And I'm just going to click through these 10 real quickly. Of all the leadership sins, the number one mistake leaders make is the top-down attitude. That's the number one leadership hang-up. It's what I call the king of the mountain syndrome. I'm on top because I'm the smartest, I'm the brightest, I founded this company, it's my company, and people are going to serve me, and I know best, so I'm going to make all the decisions, and I'm going to be a control freak. That's the worst mistake leaders make. And I talk to people all the time that work under top-down leaders, and they get very, very frustrated. Second mistake is putting paperwork before people work. Did you know that 90% of effectiveness in leadership is people skills, the soft skills, the software of working well with people? But the higher you go in leadership, the more there's paperwork and technology that stands in the way of giving yourself to people. And I'm a type A person, so I really struggle with this. I'm a task-oriented, pure German. I live by lists. And so here's the question that I ask people related to this. Are you a people person or are you a paper person? If a person walks into your space where you're working, do you view that as an opportunity or an interruption? Now, if you view that as an interruption, you're a very task-oriented person, and you have to learn to lay aside those tasks and to give yourself to people. Now, my wife is a people person, so when somebody comes into her space, she just loves it. Okay, number 3, the absence of affirmation. What could be better than a pay raise? It's been proven that people crave affirmation. And sometimes this is a blind spot. My father was a wonderful man, pure German. But the way he raised me was, if you do everything right, you're not going to hear from me because that's what's expected of you. You're only going to hear from me when you step out of line. And then I'm going to discipline you. And there are leaders and bosses like that who just assume everybody runs on autopilot and they don't pat them on the back. People desperately need affirmation. It's a huge piece of effective leadership. I don't mean insincere affirmation, but when people do a good job, they need feedback. One of the signs of a miserable job, I never get feedback. Number 4, no room for Mavericks. A leader makes a mistake if they don't allow Mavericks to thrive, because Mavericks bring us the future. Now, a Maverick, I've been around a while. When I was a kid growing up, there was this show about cowboys called Maverick, starring James Gardner. And a maverick is just an entrepreneur who doesn't follow the rules. It actually started from a guy named James Maverick, who was a cattle herder in Texas who refused to brand his cattle. And he became called a maverick because he did things different. Well, we have to make room for mavericks. We shouldn't shut them down. So that chapter really shows you how to cultivate really useful people who think outside the box. It's a big leadership mistake to shut those people down because they do bring us the future. Chapter 5, dictatorship and decision making, getting beyond I know all the answers. This whole idea of being a dictator and decision making frustrates people so much. People want to have a part in the big decisions of the company, the business, the nonprofit, whatever, the church, whatever you're running. And a dictator wants to make all the decisions themselves. Huge mistake. Right on the heels of that, chapter 6 is what I call dirty delegation. Refusing to relax and let go. Now, when I ask audiences, what is it that frustrates you most about your boss, your bad boss? This I hear all the time. They don't know how to delegate. They don't give the authority with the responsibility. And in that chapter, I go into all the reasons why really gifted, high-powered leaders don't delegate well. And the more gifted you are and the more stuff you do well, the harder it is to let go and to delegate well. But people love to get the authority with the responsibility. It's what I call the love of job ownership. If you let me own this project, I'm going to do a killer job. Chapter 7, communication chaos. And this is just about clear lines, really clarity in the organization. I always say, don't assume anybody knows anything. And sometimes leaders just don't communicate enough to all the troops, internally and externally, about what's going on. Chapter 8, missing the clues of corporate culture. Did you know every business, every company, every church, every family has their own corporate culture? It's those unwritten rules about how we do things around here. And a leader has to understand the corporate culture if they're going to lead through that culture. Chapter 9, success without a successor. Planning your departure the day you start. One of the final acts of great leadership is to cultivate the people who will replace you. And I don't think you should see that as a threat. But a really great leader, for example, can go on vacation because they have trained other people to step in. If you can never go on vacation because the place will fall apart without you, you're not cultivating successors. You're not cultivating a great team that can carry on. And finally, chapter 10, failure to focus on the future. Prepare yourself. It's later than you think. Now, you think a way that people would be totally on board with the future, but I find some leaders live in the past and they're trying to get back to the old successes that they used to experience that they're not experiencing anymore, or they just totally live in the present and they refuse to face the fact that we live in a world that is dramatically changing. And so we have to be listeners and we have to be learners, because the future where we're going to do our business, where we're going to sell our stuff or offer our services is so very different than the past or the present. So that's a quick review of the book.
Hans, you did an excellent job of taking us through that. And I would be lying if I said, as someone who owns a company, that I didn't turn a little bit red or think, I might be falling short on 2, 4, 7, 9, 10. No.
Yeah.
There's quite a few I need to check myself on for sure.
Yeah, and the cool thing about my book that people have told me is, Hans, I read it in some of the chapters, I'm like, hey, right on, I do this well. But then a lot of people give the response that you gave, oops, there's one I really don't do. I need to work on.
Yeah, you know what I love, though, is about these kind of books, if you have the right kind of attitude, that the oopses are more just like, oops, I've done it wrong. But there's a huge excitement on, but I'm going to fix it, and it's going to move forward. The books that cut you open, take out the bad stuff, put some good stuff in, are not all bad. So it's a short-term pain to get where you need to be. So I love it.
Absolutely.
But Hans, this is very relevant. This next question is: if the reader could only take away one concept, principle, or action item out of your entire book, everything you just took, 5 to 8 minutes to discuss with us, what would you want that to be?
It's all so good. It's hard to pick one.
That's why. See, I think that's a hard question. I used to preface this. It's like, hey, this is kind of a mean question to ask, and most people are, oh no, that's not bad. And I'm like, I would feel like it'd be difficult to answer.
Yeah, well, if a person thinks their whole book is good, it's a tough question to answer. However, goes back to that first chapter, the top-down attitude. I'd say the most important principle. See, the opposite of a top-down dictator is a servant leader. So I would say the one principal action item that I would take away is learn to be a servant leader, not a top-down leader. And I talk about what that is and what that isn't. Now, a servant leader is a strong leader, but a servant leader puts the good of the team in front of their own selfish desires. And that's the key of servant leadership. They care more about the good of the team and the group than just enriching themselves. It's an attitude. It's not being a slave leader where you have to let everybody walk over you and all you do is what everybody asks you to do. That's slave leadership. A servant leader puts the good of the people first. And it's the old adage, if I help the people get what they want, and if they're successful, I'll get what I want. That's servant leadership.
Excellent. You just said some very quote-worthy things right there in that answer and when you were covering your book. And that leads into our next question, which is, do you have a favorite quote from your book? Something that you think will resonate with, or that has resonated with the audience? And we take a minute to explain what it means to you.
Sure. I have a lot of quotes in the book, a lot of sidebars. But Theodore Roosevelt, he said, the best executive is the one who has sense enough to pick good men and women to do what he wants done, and self-restraint enough to keep from meddling with them while they do it. I love that, because a big part of leadership is selecting the right people. It's a huge part of leadership, and running a company and owning a company is hiring the right people or choosing the right people. But just as important as that is having the self-restraint enough to keep from meddling with them while they do what you hired them to do.
That's excellent. We're going to put that at the show notes at the elpodcast.com so our mobile listeners can go back and check that out and think on that further. So Hans, this next question, and it's our last question before we depart, but I'm not asking you for any book recommendation. We are asking you for the book. So if there was only one that you could recommend to our listeners based on the way that it's impacted your life, maybe created a lifestyle or a paradigm shift, what book would you suggest?
Oh, man. Apart from my own books, I got to be generous now. I would say Jim Collins' Good to Great, the red book, I call it. And one of the greatest paradigm shifting books I ever read. What makes great companies versus good companies, Good to Great. And let me just say, in that book, he talks about, servant leadership. People say, well, does that really work in the real business world? I say, absolutely. That's what he talked about. Level 5 leadership is servant leadership. So I'd say Good to Great for sure by Jim Collins.
Excellent book, excellent recommendation. So thank you for that. And Hans, before we depart, can you recommend the best way for our listeners to not only get more information on you, but also get more information on your book, The Top 10 Mistakes Leaders Make, and also if you can give a quick plug on more information on the podcast as well.
Sure. Everything about me you can find at my website, hansfinzel.com. HANSFINZEL, hansfinzel.com. I have all my shows on there, all my books, and how to get my podcast, The Leadership Answer Man. You can listen right on. I blog on it, so it's all right there, hansfinzel.com. Also, I have an author page on Amazon. If you just go to Amazon and type Hans Finzel, you'll find I just released my 9th book, so they're all there.
Excellent. And we'll give them a quick teaser, I guess, that episode will be coming out a little bit later, but we will also cover that book.
Awesome.
Excellent. Well, Hans, thank you so much for coming on and sharing this book with us.
I loved it, Wade. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks again for listening in today. If you'd like more information on Hans or his book, The Top 10 Mistakes Leaders Make, check out the show notes at the elpodcast.com. And if you have a book or an author that you would love to hear about, please message me on Twitter, Wade D. Danielson.
Looking for your next book idea? Head over to the elpodcast.com, where Wade shares his amazing resource, the top 10 business books recommended by over 500 entrepreneurs, with you for free. That's the elpodcast.com. Till the next time, keep it on the EL.